Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our CEO lecture. Before we begin, I'd like to introduce a few special guests who are here as part of our board meeting for the Busch School. Larry, could you stand for a moment? Larry Blanford is board member for the Busch School of Business, former CEO of Green Mountain Coffee. Give a big welcome to Larry. Marianne Means. Has last in the Means family classroom. Pat Harris is a recent grad and will be joining our board. So, and someone who I hope needs no introduction, our very own Tim Busch. We only two other board members, Tim's behind him, so I get a chance to introduce him later, but I'd like to ask Tim to come up and introduce our speaker for tonight.
Thank you, Andrew. It's always a pleasure to be back. During the pandemic, we haven't had a great opportunity to be here as often, but with a beautiful Washington, D.C. day, it's a joy to be here. We had a lot of meetings yesterday on the board, and board of visitors, and more meetings tomorrow. So I bring to you a longtime friend of mine from Orange County. He's kind of got a dual residence like me in Orange County, New York. David oversees, through his management firm, $3.5 million of client assets at the Bahnsen Group, which has offices in New York and Beach. He's a frequent guest on CNBC, Bloomberg, Fox News, and Fox Business. I'm regularly working out to hear his voice on television. He's a regular contributor to National Review. He hosts a popular weekly podcast called Capital Record, which is very good. Dedicated to the defense of free enterprise and capital markets. He's a regular lecturer at the Acton Institute, which is a free market institute started in Grand Rapids, Michigan by a Catholic priest, Father Sorico, and the Center of Agricultural Leadership. He writes daily investment commentary called Dividend Cafe, which I do read every day. And the daily one is DC Today, and then Dividend Cafe. David is the founding trustee. He founded a high school, a Christian high school in Newport Beach called Pacific Christian High School. He serves on the board of directors of the National Review and King's College. He's the author of several best-selling books, Crisis of Responsibility, Our Cultural Addiction to Blame, and How to Cure It. The Case of Dividend Growth, Investing in the Post-Crisis World, which is really his business model. His new book, which I recommend anybody should read, whether you're in business or not. There's no free lunch, 250 economic truths, just recently released last fall. So this has statements by people that you would know, from Adam Smith, Charles Koch, who helped fund this school. And they're really truisms about the economy, free market capitalism that even I could use a little refreshment. Personally, note, David and his wife, Jolene, have been married for 20 years. They're devout Christians, they have 3 children, Mitchell, Graham, and Sadie. He's the recipient of the NAP Institute, which I started, Virtuous Marketplace Award, which is a conference that we do every year with the business school in New York City called Principles of Entrepreneurship. He spoke a number of times at the Busch School of Business with the Catholic University of America and the NAP Institute of Entrepreneurship with Virtuous Online. He's just an amazing speaker. For most guys that are trading stocks, not as exciting, don't think through all the issues that his money guys. He is more of a grounded person, understanding culture, faith, our society, how that interplays with stocks, and also how we might change that. So he's a writer, speaker, and thinker. He manages our personal family money, including our foundation money that is used to help fund Busch School, and many of our clients have also managed their money. So with that, I will bring to you Dave Bahnsen to speak for a while, and then open it up for your great questions. questions that I always see. So welcome, David.
Well, thank you, Tim, for the very kind introduction. Thank you all for coming here on this beautiful day to hear me speak. It was less than an hour ago that I landed at Reagan and got here in time, and I'm excited. He mentioned this daily market commentary that I write called dctoday.com. DC does stand for Dividend Cafe, not District of Columbia, but most people don't know that because they talk about public policy so much. They think it's a DC play. But I got to ride around the airplane today, and I realized that most of the time I'm flying back and forth to New York, California. I'm traveling on a weekend or Sunday night or something. And there's something about writing that commentary on the airplane when you're not being interrupted either by family or by office mates. That makes for a much better commentary. So it's kind of refreshing. And I got to do that because I was coming here to see you. So thank you. I want to reference something Tim mentioned in the introduction as a setup for my talk tonight. He mentioned my most recent book, which is called There's No Free Lunch, 250 Economic Truths. But he also mentioned my very first book, which was called Crisis of Responsibility, Our Cultural Addiction to Blame and How You Cure It. And though I stole this expression from Father Sirico of the Acton Institute, I'm quite sure he stole it from many others who come before him. All of us, as you well know, stand on the shoulders of giants. But I have been very, very clear throughout my career on Wall Street and throughout those I encounter on a daily basis that my mission in life is to advocate for a free and virtuous society. And I blame those on the political and often economic right for the fact that we talk as if the free society and the virtuous society are two different things. And now we need to get the salt and the pepper back together on the plate, on the table again. And it is my view, in keeping with the great Catholic tradition, these two things are inseparable. And I think that there's been a shift in the culture. At one point after the 1960s, there was an incredible embrace of the free society part of this equation. And we now characterize it as this talk about the 80s as a decade of greed, as President Reagan is this great deregulator, the movie Wall Street coming out and everybody loving the hedonism of the movie. And then now we talk about the resurgence of the virtuous society part, that all of a sudden we're interested in being good people again, caring for each other. Everyone's gotten a little softer. It's been kind of a good thing, postmodernism, that we're all nice people again, or at least trying to be. I don't know if I agree when I turn on the news that everyone seems like nice people again. And I don't know if I think it's a fair characterization of 1980s economics that was entirely driven by free libertine aspirations. But I do think it's fair enough that there's an embrace right now of the concept of a society, a framework that works well for everyone. Of course, the problem is that the bulk of people do talk about that in the context of equality, meaning we will have a more virtuous society, allegedly, if rich people make less money and poor people make more money. And I want every single poor person to make more money. There is a really key verb I used there. You can guess what it was. But I do want all poor people to be richer. And I really don't think much about rich people becoming poor. It isn't important to me. And I remain a bit confused why it is important to some. But see, I don't think that construct of income divide and wealth divide has anything to do with virtue. And in fact, I think that a lot of people driving it and sort of the mechanisms that they want to use to get there are incredibly unvirtuous, primarily confiscation as well. I think the notion of confiscation that comes out of covetousness would be antithetical to the Christian worldview in our understanding of virtue. In fact, we violate the grand finale of the Ten Commandments, which was the last and 10th commandment of thou shalt not covet. So the reason I brought up my book, Crisis of Responsibility, and it was the first book I had written, and I'm not a particularly well-known author now, but it is very different writing this last book and having it come out after I've been on television for 5 years and other books and hit the bestseller list. And yet when that crisis responsibility book came out, I had a successful financial practice. It wasn't well known in the public square by any means. And that book was very difficult to get word out and really push the message. There was never a chance that writing books was ever going to be a day job for me, but I did care about that message a lot. I worked really hard to get it out there. And my view is that when I was writing about crisis of responsibility would have been a very different book if, when I wrote about my last book, There's No Free Lunch, had been marinated throughout society. And by society, I mean all people. Like if I could convert AOC and Bernie Sanders to become capitalists, then everything would be different. Well, of course it would be, but I can't, and I won't, right? I'm referring to people who have a general impulse in favor of free enterprise that are mostly sympathetic to the idea of free markets. There may be disagreements on the edges of certain policy issues. People that are labeled themselves as free marketeers can always disagree about what the high marginal tax rate should be. Should we have minimum wage laws? What regulations are appropriate, inappropriate? I very much believe, and I'm quite certain this is true of a lot of the educational philosophy here at this fine school. I do not believe we will ever get much wrong in practice when we get theory right. Now, we will have disagreements in practice, but most of what really plagues society is not that we all agreed in the theoretical or in the metaphysical or in the philosophical or in the theological. We got all that right, and then just somehow there's these incredible divisions in application. There would be disagreements on the edges on this side of the glory, but I believe almost always the truly problematic divides in society are in the theoretical. And I'm applying this right now to the right, in that I think there are a lot of people capably at times defending the instinct of free enterprise. Free markets are a pretty obvious superior allocator of resources and a sort of adjudicator of risk and reward. And there's not a ton of controversy around that. So people that fall into a defense of free enterprise can kind of be aligned in that general instinct of liking a profit motive or liking the notion of businesses taking on risk and reward. But I believe that when they lack the philosophical presuppositions necessary for people who defend the notion of a free society that I want to defend, that I think we get into a lot of trouble. And we end up going 20 or 30 years working backwards. Because for some period of time, we actually abandoned the notion of markets as a wonderful way to set an economic framework of society. And then we go through 20 or 30 years where we believe in this sort of Randian and objectivist notion that greed is good, and that in fact, free markets, once you have the freedom, the virtue becomes irrelevant. And all of this is entirely avoidable for what I presume is the case for most of you in this room. I don't want to take for granted anyone's own faith convictions. But those of us who hold to the biblical worldview have no room ever to hold free and virtuous society at odds with each other or as two pieces, but rather an integral, necessary, holistic vision of a society. And that is all a byproduct of what we believe the world was made to be, back to the Garden of Eden. This notion of creational economics that I believe in from the core of my being is what I'll advocate for the next 30, 40 years that we're willing God gives me. And when I say this is connected to my first book, Crisis of Responsibility, I think if I can guess what age undergrad college students are now, you all would have been very, very young at the time of the financial crisis. But I think that we went through a period of time in 2007, 2008, where our society lost its mind. And then we really lost our mind in how we came out of the financial crisis. And all we're doing today, I understand COVID, I certainly now understand the reality of Ukraine, But economically, macroeconomically, we're dealing with a hangover from decisions made in the financial crisis that the lion's share of people want to treat as if they were policy failures. But I want those who hold to a Christian worldview to understand it was not primarily a policy failure. It was a failure of the concept of a free and virtuous society. And so what I mean by this is when it comes to free society, there were impediments in the marketplace that encouraged malinvestment. There were decisions made that came out of interventions right here in this town, the concept of Fannie and Freddie subsidizing housing to the degree they did, over-levering. I can make that case, and tons of people would agree with me. We can criticize Wall Street for over-leverage, we can criticize Fannie and Freddie for the kind of cronyist dynamic that existed. For-profit company, they got the profits, but not for-loss company, the taxpayers got the losses. Okay, it's a very sinful concept to begin with, but it also was by damaging the economy. So you have Fannie Freddie to blame. You have the Fed, who you could argue put a little kerosene on the fire to hopefully accommodate the monetary policy. And you had, like I mentioned, the leverage that had built up within Wall Street. So there's a lot of components that hurt the free part of this. There are interventions that do not represent what I would view as the ideal for free exchange, free transactions, free functioning of markets. There was a lot of problems there. But when you look at the virtuous side of it, what you had time and time again were individuals who were operating out of a spirit of covetousness. I want this house because my neighbor just got a new one, and I'm willing to lie on a mortgage application to say I can afford it. And it won't catch up with me because the house keeps going higher in price, and the whole society playing the same game at the same time. But then how can that go on forever? People aren't willing to lose that kind of net worth, but they didn't have to fear losing net worth because the reality is it was almost entirely concentrated in California, Arizona, Nevada, Florida, non-recourse states where people could just walk away. And that's what they did, and that's what caused the financial crisis, and no one in 14 years has been willing to say it. No one on the right wants to say it because it takes away the blame from Fannie and Freddie and the Fed and government policy and other things that were very problematic. No one on the left wants to say it because it takes away the blame from Wall Street and the banks and greedy corporate America and all their normal cast of characters that they find contemptible. But the reason why I want to say it is because a virtuous society would never have had the financial crisis. Because people living within their means, people being honest in their transactions, people not driven by rank and abject covetousness, the entire dynamic comes down. Are there individual transactions where people get in over their skis? Of course, there always has been. But systemically, to a point of breaking the back of the world economy. But the problem with that moment in time was not just a whole lot of people had to learn the idolatry of homeownership was a bad idea. A whole lot of people had to learn that the way financial markets were structured without adequate pain being felt by risk takers. That had to be changed. Right? The pain for risk takers is a very good thing. I can talk more about that in Q&A if you want. But our whole society basically had to reframe a lot of things that were done. But what happened is we now have had 1.6% real GDP growth for 14 years. 14 years. Well, we're not still purging out housing. We're trying our best to create another housing crisis. We're not still dealing with a depressed stock market. Stock market's up 472% since that moment. We're not still dealing with recessionary unemployment. We have basically the most unemployment in history. So what do I mean that we're still dealing with a hangover effect? To treat the damage done in the financial crisis, we poured trillions of dollars of additional spending. And this Keynesian notion was not Keynesian in the Keynesian sense of the mid-20th century, which I, by the way, also think was wrong, but at least then came from a starting point of budget equilibrium. We started from a vantage point of 10 trillion in debt, and then piled on and had to do it in Europe, Japan, UK, and of course here in the United States. And then to help for that debt and stimulate a reflation of the economy. It's one thing if the household sector needed to delever, but we couldn't have corporate America delevering. And they knew there were plenty of great economic actors out there, like guys like Tim Busch, that were going to be able to go do new projects and build value, build wealth. So they wanted corporate America reflating because that's what good decision makers were. Household sector had to delever because there was all this excess and nonsense, right? So then monetary policy has to come down to 0 interest rates, and they left it there for 7 years. And the quantitative easing 1, 2, and 3. So now in your college careers, we're dealing with COVID monetary policy, COVID fiscal policy, but it was all a direct replay of what was done post-financial crisis. But they never got off of it. They never ignored it. It's like, oh, COVID was a shame because we had just got done coming out of all this financial crisis. They never got back to normalcy because of the excesses that led to financial crisis, which I'm arguing were lack of virtue driven. We go to treat the problem with this blood and monetary and fiscal medicine, and now we're stuck in it. And what has been the byproduct? What has been the effect? Subpar economic growth. What happens when you get subpar economic growth? Well, you get populism, sometimes right-wing populism. You get President Trump, you get Brexit, you get protests, you get Canadian truck drivers, you get all of those things. People are mad, and sometimes they're mad for a good reason, sometimes not. Sometimes they handle it out in the right way, sometimes not. But that's all populism is someone's frustrated about something. I'm not a populist, and I don't like populism, primarily because I'm a Christian. But populism usually has some reason that it started that is reasonably understandable. But you get left-wing populism too. You get an absolute obsession, what I talked about earlier, the divide in income, and the divide in wealth in a society. I've studied this historically as much as I think a person can, and there is essentially no period in history that there was an obsession with inequality when the lower end of economic ownership, income earners was moving higher. When people are doing better, they do not care that much how much better people above them are also doing. The point at which you get maximum resentment in class struggle and what gave birth in the mid-19th century to Marxism is when one side of the divide is all of a sudden having their absolute standard of living, their quality of life diminish. That becomes great fodder to feed the resentment and envy and whatnot. So my point is that if you follow my dominoes and any one of these premises, I'm very happy to defend, but the logic of how I'm moving from premise to conclusion hopefully is valid enough. I believe there was a crisis of virtue, a crisis of responsibility that was not just totally acceptable for people of faith. It was totally foreign to the American DNA. If you study the Great Depression, the one thing you know is, first of all, the real unemployment, 30%, 28%. You had people working 3-4 jobs and could not fulfill those people. But they paid bills. And when they couldn't, it was shameful. It deteriorated their own well-being. The notion of walking away from a bill and then going out to the bar Friday night to brag about it was absolutely unheard of. And it would have been unheard of just a few years before 2008. But that was the story of 2008 in a lot of ways, where Tim and I reside in Busch County. It was sort of being zero for a lot of this. So many of the subprime lenders were based there. I can tell you, it was completely systemic. There wasn't even an iota of shame of people giving back houses, walking away from obligations. It was the exact opposite. The society moved to a place of being quite proud of their sin and quite proud of this financial responsibility. Well, in an individual transaction, you could say, look, I think that's a bad guy. I shouldn't have done that. I don't want to be friends with them. I certainly want to do business with them. But the problem is it wasn't isolated. It became macro. Now that macro crisis of responsibility then became the policy response. Okay, we were all over levered. There were other bad actors from Wall Street to K Street to Main Street. But then the way that they were going to heal it, which again, I happen to believe policymakers were well intentioned. I think there were a ton of mistakes made, but I don't question the motives of Secretary Paulson and Bernanke. I think that to the extent that they believed it was the right thing to do, I take that as a word, but I just think it comes down to the most obvious fact in policymaking history. You make policies during a crisis to solve the crisis you're in now, and you assume someone else will deal with the ramifications later, right? I mean, I don't think anyone during March of 2020 was saying, okay, we're about to spend $2 trillion on CARES Act, how are we gonna pay for it? It was trying to plug the gap right then and say, if they're gonna shut down the country, we gotta figure out how we're gonna get some money into people that are really getting hurt, and then I guess we'll kind of figure it all out later. But the problem is that people don't figure it out later. You guys are gonna have to figure out a lot of it. But I don't believe that when a lot of folks of my generation, I'm gonna turn 48 next month, so I'm pretty young compared to some people here, but a little old compared to some. I still think of myself at your guys' age, and really I know I'm closer to Tim's age, so it's like kind of stuck in this middle spot here of what they call a Gen X for a reason. But this is the fact. I've been listening to my whole life and saying, well, we're leaving all this debt for our kids and grandkids. That's all true. It's always been talked as if what that means is we're leaving you this iceberg, and you're just about to hit this thing, there's going to be this crisis. And all of a sudden, everything's just going to fall in the ocean, Armageddon, apocalypse, use whatever graphic and kind of sensationalistic imagery you want. That is not my belief as to what we face. I think we face something worse than a volcano or a tornado or an iceberg or something. Yeah. Because out of really, really bad crisis, you usually kind of blow things up and purge a lot of stuff out. It's awful. And then there's this chance for immediate rebuilding. But I think we're in this slow drip moment where bit by bit by bit, we're taking away future economic growth, this stagnation where we're getting subpar, sub-potential economic output. At the same time, culturally, people want less kids. They want to get married way later. They want to totally deny the fact that the key to a happy life is from work and output and labor and productivity. One of the most obvious psychological and teleological realities in human history. So we're in this moment of this cultural denial at the same time that the economics are requiring us to not do that, to accept that the only way out of it is going to be greater output, greater productivity. We have a really, really rich bank account we're drawing from. That is the bank account of the American experiment. The capital was invested by family fathers, by this vision of a society that is largely entrepreneurial. That's not going away right away. I don't worry about that the way some of my friends on the right do, that they're going to fundamentally change America immediately. But I don't think things have to fundamentally change immediately. I think that when you look at fertility, we went from 2.9 to 2.8 to 2.7, we go from 2.9 to 1.6. And all of a sudden, getting down finally below 2.1, and then it has now dropped to 1.6. I think it comes a bit higher post-COVID. But my point is, it's not the replacement rate of a society. It's not the acceptable understanding of what either free or virtuous society would look like. This hatred of children is just abominable. And I think that it's economically treacherous. And it's happening at the same time that you need more production. You only get consumption out of production. And this is where I'm going to come back to my speech. I'm so off the roads right now, really. I have a way of getting off. My point is that this domino effect that I believe started in the post-1960s abandonment of virtue responsibility that led to economic realities that we're ill prepared to deal with. Because yes, there's still a really good portion of people who say, I like free markets. What I keep is mine, what you keep is yours. High taxes are not good to a point, high regulation, but there's not a sort of philosophical commitment to the principles. Had there been, we wouldn't have got into this mess But I can't do anything about that. You can't do anything about that. I would not give a speech about all the things people did wrong in 1968, or I would give a speech about how so much of the Christian and Catholic economic foundation relied upon secular economists because we didn't have enough good ones of our own. That's another whole problem. It's evident throughout my whole book. My economic heroes were largely, until the Michael Novaks and Pablo Cerritos came around, it was slim pickings because in Christendom, because the greatest we have are Friedrich Hayek and Ludwig von Mises and Milton Friedman, and none of whom professed a saving faith in Christ. And right now, I think we have this opportunity to bring not only salvific understanding of faith, holistic vision of virtuous society, to a really incredible economic competence. And that synthesis can change the entire world. And it cannot just change GDP growth. That's very important. It cannot just change our debt profile, which I think is very important. But I think it can change the number one biggest thing that is damaging our society right now, which is this unbelievable alienation. The social, personal, existential loneliness that has led to the drug epidemic, opioid epidemic, suicide, the divorce rate. I mean, it's tragic. And I think all of those things change exponentially when reconnected to the vision of a free and virtuous society. They can't get fixed apart from free society that is rooted in economic vision, because people cannot be happy when they're robots. They cannot be happy when they're not productive. I'm going to come back to that in a second. But they also cannot be happy lacking virtue, because first of all, it's impossible for humans to be happy when they're being disobedient to God. I hope you all know that. I know it very well. I know it because I've been disobedient, as we all have. And it's never made me happy. Disobedience takes away, not just individually, but out of a culture, takes away the capacity for enjoyment, for peace, for joy, for the concept of human flourishing. So now this is where I want to bridge what happened out of crisis responsibility, led to financial crisis, but now gave us this domino effect of monetary policy and fiscal policy that has really, I think, left us in kind of an economic lurch, and bring it back to the foundations that I wrote this last book about. You say, well, what is in your new book that would treat all of it? I want us to defend free markets, starting in the Garden of Eden, or I don't want us to defend free markets at all. Because ultimately, there are really smart people, secularists, rationalists, humanists, and they're going to see through this in a second and realize that if all you're saying you need to defend free markets is they're a pretty good mechanism for allocating resources, and that's what all your point is, because they are. It's just not that complicated to point out. But all someone has to do is game the system on top of that and not get caught. See, the argument is always, well, yeah, but if you get caught, then it's going to hurt you, so no one ever want to do it. But what's the solution to that? Just work really hard and smart and not get caught doing bad things. I think funny people came out of 2008 totally unimpaired. If they got rid of all these overpriced houses that they were using as trading cards before the music quit playing, they were fine. This notion that there is a kind of embedded logic as to why people would never let that happen is simply untrue once we have an understanding of human nature. But there's another component of human nature that brings me back to why I want free enterprise, but connected to creational economics, and that is anthropology. It's how God made us. It's why God made us. It's why God made us for Him. It's why I believe that God cares about humans more than animals, because He said so. Because He gave us souls, because He gave us dignity, because He put us in His image and not any other member of the animal kingdom. And then within just a few verses in Genesis 1, we get a framework of economics, not just theology, that too, not just science, and people get all bent out of shape on that stuff. But I don't have to do that, because here's what is indisputable. God said that he was giving mankind a special nature that was like his. And we know in biblical theology that there's the transcendent and the immanent. There's things we share with God and things we do not share with God. So we don't know all things. He told Adam and Eve to eat from this tree. We can't know everything, right? And then there are things we can do. What can we do to share with God? First and foremost, what's the first example? Genesis 1:26. We can be creative and productive. Well, who's creative and productive? Where do we get that from? That's from God. Is there anyone more creative than God? But right there in Genesis 1, the story of us being made, that he loved us, he wanted us to be companion to him, and that he asked us to go co-create with him. He said, I made this world, but God did not make the iPhone. But there isn't anything in this iPhone that God didn't make. The raw materials that go into it, the whole way that silicon works, and then the ideas. Okay, that's the main thing. The physical part of the iPhone is the easy part. The ideas that have gone into shaping what digital technology, all of us completely take for granted, why wouldn't we? But nothing was new was made in 1960 that then became an idea in 1980 that became an iPhone in 2008 or 07. All of the raw materials were made thousands of years ago in the Garden of Eden. The only thing that happened is that God said to mankind, take the potential of my creation and go pull it into the actual. Extract through stewardship and productive behavior. Now, I believe that this is not just a commandment, that we're disobedient when we don't do it. I believe it was a blessing. And I understand chapter or two later, sin comes in. But never after the fall did God take away the blessing of work. The curse was that there would now be the toil and the challenge and the heaviness. But all throughout Old and New Testament scripture, we see the blessing of work being added to these efforts. But it all came down pre-sin to it being our existential purpose in life, to co-create with God, to be stewards of the earth. So once I start my economic philosophy with this anthropology, God made me to be creative and productive. I also now know throughout, which in the interest of time I won't unpack fully, but we know that God made all people in his image. So therefore to see someone starving, hurting, we know from Jesus' earthly ministry how pivotally important it was that we care for the least of them. And so we develop a theology of philanthropy, of compassion, of humanitarianism, all those things. That's okay, I get that. But here's the thing. I don't feel comfortable stripping away half of humanity from the lesson of Genesis 1. That all people are made to be productive and creative. So to the extent that my solution for those people is that my productivity go up and everyone else's consumption stay low enough, that there be enough net difference called capital, called wealth. That's the easy, if you just remember this algebra, you'll get so many things in life right. P minus C equals W. It's the most basic formula that is forgotten by most PhDs at MIT in the world. Production minus consumption equals wealth. So you can focus on more production or less consumption or both, or you can focus on more consumption and be content to have a negative wealth. You can do with math what you want, but P minus C equals W. And I have a very hard time theologically saying that half of humanity is removed from the P, that the productive capacity God made us for, that they're not worthy of that, we're not capable of it, but that we can all work harder and again, meet their needs, their human needs, because food and water and shelter are a human need, and there are people who don't have those things, and those needs have to be met. They have to be met by men and women of Christian character. But it doesn't end there, because our vision for a free and virtuous society feeds those who are hungry, while at the same time advocating for this anthropology. Anthropology that a lot of people here in the room have been blessed by, right? We know God made us in his image. There's a dignity there, and we get this blessing to be productive. I don't want to take away that blessing from any man, woman, or child on earth. That is the starting point of a framework of what I now call free market economics, free enterprise. They don't care for the word capitalism, by the way. Karl Marx made it up. He was trying to trick you into using it. And it could be used against you someday by like Elizabeth Warren and it worked. So capitalism is not an unpopular word because it talks as if the ism is about capital. And capital is a tool, but the ism is Genesis 1. The ism is creational economics, anthropology, how man interacts in this world. And you then out of that say, okay, well, what do we know about man? Man is rational, man is reasonable, there's a certain self-interest. And then you get down to that production, consumption thing. This is where the financial crisis came. Kind of understand. I don't know about you guys, but I just don't believe any of you need to be told to consume. All things being equal, I think it's very easy for us to go feed our own appetites. We know what food we like, we know what drinks we like, we know what movies we like. And if all things are equal, we have the time and money and whatnot to do it, we're okay. But Americans do a really good job consuming. Humans do a really good job consuming. The part that needs incentives, the part that needs mentoring, nurturing, discipleship, all these things, is the production. But economic activity that is wholesome and helpful and avoids financial crises and avoids the kind of stagnant economic growth we're getting now, that's the part that we have to be focused on. So we now, for 80 years in American economic life, intellectually, have operated on the entire key to revitalizing the economy is to get us to just demand more. The silliest thing ever advocated by entire Ivy League universities. And if we could just get everyone to spend more money, everything would be okay. And of course, what you have now got is 30 trillion of sovereign debt. That's just federal government. It does not include states, does not include counties, does not include cities, does not include corporate America, and does not include households. Okay, so the notion that we need to be taught how to consume goes against the data of the aggregate debt level. And then this brings me down to the economic foundation. I said before, P minus C equals W. Production minus consumption is wealth, but here's another one. S equals I. Okay? Easy one. Savings equals investment. Nobody in world history has ever invested a dollar that wasn't first saved. The dollar had to come from somewhere. So some activity happened that generated a dollar, and then that activity could be invested into something productive or not, but it came out of the savings. The second it was spent, it was no longer available to be an invested dollar. This is a tautology and it's not controversial in economics. We now want to say that we're either going to get more productivity without more I, investment, or we're going to get more I without more S, savings, or we're going to get more growth without productivity. My view is S goes to I, which goes to P, which goes to G. Savings to investment, productivity to growth. This is very non-controversial, and my belief is we need growth because we need it economically and we need it spiritually. We need a society that's thriving, that's fulfilled, and that does have a genesis in savings. So the economic belief system we bring to these things, combined with this overall worldview, to me, has profound implications for how we get to where we need to go for growth. Growth related to how we're going to pay back debt, growth related to how we're going to get new goods and services to enhance quality of life more and bring about a greater experience for your generation, generation after, and so forth and so on. We are fighting now on two fronts, those very things that we need. We need savings to get to growth, and we have an economic philosophy and a cultural philosophy that is against savings. We need virtue and an understanding of obedience in the garden and subsequent biblical theology to get us to live and function the way we want, to have a social cooperation that works for society, an obedience that even has a heart for the poor and things of that nature. We are antinomian to the core. We do not care for biblical obedience. We do not care for the concept of man being created in the garden with dignity. And we think that we can go quote Ayn Rand and get the vision and the inspiration to mobilize the next generation of free enterprise. My belief is that the notions I wrote about crisis and responsibility went wrong because we've abandoned a comprehensive vision of a free and virtuous society, but that to rediscover that vision, we ultimately have to rediscover the principles that I'm talking about that are centered in this concept of creational economics that started the Garden of Eden, worked their way throughout the book of Revelation, and then now have been proven throughout history when applied to bear great fruit. Not perfect, because we're not utopian. We accept the imperfectibility of these things on this side of glory, and yet we never abandon the goal of human flourishing. So I do look up to Milton Friedman a great deal. I think he was brilliant. And I do agree with the nomenclature of free to choose, which was his famous PBS documentary and book, and kind of his sort of libertarian summation of free economics was that we want a society where we're free to choose. I mostly agree with it, but I don't believe it covers the entire story. I want a society that is free to flourish, and I do not believe that we are free to flourish only from choice. A free society economically will have choice and will have better economic results for a time. But the sustainability of it and the optimization of it, that I believe would really represent flourishing, the spiritual and the physical. Why do I care about the spiritual and the physical in an economy? Because I care about the physical and spiritual and humanity. That's all an economy is the sum of human action. Humans acting around the allocation of scarcity. What do we know about the human person, about all the human beings in this room? We are physical, material beings, and material needs, material wants, and all those things are good. And we are spiritual beings. And the notion of trying to fight these two things or pretend that they're separated, that one can have a complete ignoring of the spiritual component and satisfy the material, or vice versa, is dangerous. But it has created the economic landscape we have today. So I hope that these dots have been connected to some degree. I've covered a lot of ground, and there's a lot of tangents that I've gone on that really the conversation invites. And I'm happy to address any of them in Q&A. But this is the vision of my life. This is what I care about more than anything. I'm very blessed that I do wake up really happy every day. I'm blessed to have my wife and children, as I mentioned in the introduction, and I'm blessed that I care about my work, and it is not merely a job, it's something I find a lot of fulfillment in, and I don't take it for granted. I have a lot of gratitude for the life I have. But I also believe that there is no blessing I have in my life that I would want taken away from any other person. If I could merely give someone all the money they need to be fed, but not give them the opportunity to go build a business or feel satisfaction in their work or overcome adversity. I've had a lot of adversity in my life. I was not born into Wall Street, I assure you. And yet that's the part I want for humanity, is them to taste of the incredible satisfaction that comes from creational economics, of creating, innovating, and producing the way God made us to. Thank you very much. It's the longest I've gone without civil water in my entire life.
It was worth, I can say so. If you have encapsulated this short time, pretty much what they are learning over 4 years. I've not heard it well put together. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Does that mean they're not going to class anymore?
No, it means you reinforce. Nice job. So open to questions now. Maybe I take Dean's privilege right in collecting their thoughts. You touched on the idea of paying for risk takers and invited. If I throw that back as a first question. Sure.
Yeah, I think that a lot of times there's this expression skin in the game, and I think that a lot of people would say, I mean, defensive of free enterprise, I like markets because then people can really generate the rewards from decisions. And so much of interventionist economics, whether it's the Fed with monetary policy or this Keynesian notion of fiscal intervention, is centered around the belief that we need to do something to buffer risk taking or business cycle realities. And I don't know, I think we're all familiar with the stories of these great inventors and entrepreneurs that had failures, and then one day they had successes. And how those stories are not incredibly inspiring to people as we all read. Like I tear up, every time I review these stories of people that failed and struck out and then had their kind of comeback. And I think I tear up because it is the story of the Garden of Eden, of what God was asking us to do, go out and innovate, produce, cultivate. And yet, I don't think that there's such thing as the benefiting from reward without the reality of risk. And sometimes the risk bites us hard, sometimes it's less so. There's a lot of quotes in my book from Charles Koch, as a matter of fact, and on the subject is that risk-taking, and sometimes risk-taking that really hurts us, sets the stage for the greater activities that need to happen. But this is fundamentally a difference from central planning and a free enterprise society. Is the free enterprise society says you have to have risk, you have to have loss, you have to have failure to get gain, to get wealth creation, etc. It is just simply absurd to think that every productive activity comes without ever misgauging the consumer, without ever having competition alter things, without certain just weather and natural circumstances becoming problematic. There's just things that happen in that course. And so what we have done, I believe, with our capital allocation policies in our country, keeping alive zombie companies, which is just destroying forward growth. And also the concept of trying to create a buffer for everyone all the time. It is suffocating future reward by not accepting the reality of risk in the present term.
Thanks, Marcus.
Thanks so much for coming and speaking today. I'm Scott McKenna, I'm a senior in the business school now. My question resonates with what you said, specifically towards the end of your talk, that you have so much passion in the work you do and really enjoy it. And here at the Busch School, we take a class freshman year taught by Luke Burgess and Andreas Winberg titled the Education Business, where we dive in and start asking ourselves those questions. 4 years later, as a senior now, you see that's not a straight line path to find the answer. So kind of wanted to ask you if you could provide some insight to finding your passion with the goggles of your talk today, maybe just talking for some of that stuff.
Yeah, it's a great question. And, I will just very quickly get biographical. I don't like to do this all the time, but I started off after graduating high school as a freshman at USC, where my father had gotten his doctorate, and I was born when he was a grad student there. And I just always assumed I was going to go off to business school and study and work hard, and then end up having a career in business and hopefully all went well in finance. But my dad was a Christian intellectual. They didn't have a lot of money, and my mom was already gone. And before my first semester finished, my father passed away. He was younger than I am now when he died. And I left FC and I never went back, and everything changed. And so there is a sense in which, when I tell people chase your passions, I was driven in my early 20s by survival. And I now am a successful business owner that has the luxury of telling people the utterly asinine advice to chase their passions. I've never heard a poor person tell someone to chase their passions. Poor people are too smart and realistic for that. And I would have never said something so stupid 28 years ago. I believe people should chase their skills and that they will find passion in doing what they do very well. And that is Arthur Brooks talks about marrying our passions to our skills, and I agree with it 1,000%. But the idea of some sort of romantic notion that we have something and we're totally agnostic as to whether we're good at it or not, and whether or not other people think we're good at it, or whether or not market mechanisms instead can support us and allow for our livelihood and support. That all we are supposed to do is, if we like something, just go do it. If that's all, my daughter's 14, if all she has to do is what she likes doing, she's going to be standing in front of her phone making a TikTok video for the rest of her life. And I don't think it pays for well. I guess the summer does for a while. But you see my point. So I'm for passions being in the mix, but I'm not for blindly chasing it. I believe skills have to start, and then they will find passions. Is there someone out there who's just incredibly passionate about something they're terrible at? And are there people that are really good at things that they just hate? Maybe, but I don't think so very often. So I'm in favor of weighing the skill side and the talents a little heavier than the passions at a younger age, and letting those things come together. And then, I do believe I'm doing the right thing when I know I'm passionate about it, but those things unfold for me organically. And I always think about people who took, you said it was a freshman class, those materials of vocational training, I think would have been profoundly beneficial for me in my young life. But for whatever reason, got a different fan for how my life started out. And I didn't think of it that way. But now I look back on it and I feel like I'm one of those people I hate that is telling people to go do something because like I've already arrived or whatever. And I think that you need more practical advice. And practically speaking, I think people have to start with what they're good at and allow it to fold into what they're passionate about.
Thank you so much.
I hope that's helpful.
How you doing? My name is Joshua Stone. Yes, my question would be, I heard you speak on the topic about this epidemic of loneliness. I didn't really understand that then, but I kind of get a sense of what you were saying. You said how it's kind of affecting today's generation. It's affecting marriages. Can you just elaborate on that and give me some, I guess, factors that are leading to this this epidemic?
Yeah, so I think that there's this negative feedback loop going on where I believe is what's caused an epidemic of loneliness, of isolation, of alienation, evidenced in sociological data. So why do I think that exists? Because of the undeniable data and the empirical support for that belief. When we look at opioid overdoses, divorces, people identify as unhappy. There's some people who lie, but there's an awful lot of people just admitting that they're unhappy more so than ever. And so you look to this kind of sociological framework where there's a lot of people that identify as unhappy and that have life circumstances that indicate alienation and isolation. And it's my belief that we have two instruments that have caused that. And that is the lack of a nuclear family and the lack of marketplace. Because in the marketplace, people find telos, they find activity, they find productive activity, the things I talked about in terms of racial economics. And then in nuclear family, they find companionship, and they find support, and they find unconditional love. And I don't know anybody who's happy who doesn't have somebody who loves them unconditionally. Family and friendship are the building block of a healthy personal existence. And then extrinsically, our activities, our work, our purpose, are largely embodied in a term I'm using called the marketplace, but it's not merely an economic construct. It's a sort of construct of all human activity. So what are the two things that are most under attack in 2022? If you want to turn on the news and say, what are people most against today? It seems to me it's the family and the marketplace. So the negative feedback loop is the two things that would be therapeutic to the big problem are the two things most under attack. And I don't know how we fix an epidemic of loneliness if we don't have a restoration of family, and we don't have a restoration of marketplace and productive activity. And yet, I think we're going the wrong direction with those things. So I know that's a little simplistic, but I think it's mostly right. Now, there are nuances. There's other cases that don't fit exactly in those lanes and categories, but I hope you see what I'm saying. In the concept of a free and virtuous society, you have more covenant keeping in marriage, you have more responsibility taking for decisions people make, you have more loyalty in friendships. You have what Aristotle referred to as kind of this motivation for civility, right? In our civic life. I believe that a higher vision for marketplace and family wedded together, which is obviously kind of the whole essence of Catholic public theology. That to me represents a solution to the things that are right now plaguing society. So when someone comes and says, are you ignoring the problems of deindustrialization and the rest of all development? Or do you really think that global trade or China in the WTO or technology and a lot of job replacement because of advancements in the digital world, you don't think any of these things have any role? I always say, of course they have a role, but they're not the fundamental problem. They're add-ons underneath a framework that I think is fundamentally lost vision for family and marketplace.
Thank you.
Sir. No, we have a hand up there.
My name is Jack. I'm a senior here. I just want to thank you for your time coming out. I really enjoyed getting to listen to what you talked about. My question is more so about what you talked about in the beginning. Do you foresee any sort of rising leadership that's going to promote the free and virtuous economy that you talked about? And then for all of us sitting here, how can we go out and evangelize this idea among our peers in our society as we go into the business world?
It's a great question, and I believe that there's a chance you mean, do I envision that in the political class? But you didn't say that, so maybe you don't, and it would be incredible if you didn't, but I would understand if you did, because that's usually what most people mean. Like, how do we get a great political leader, especially, here in this town, that can come lead us in the federal government, or maybe a governor in a state or whatnot. I actually do think all that's important, but I think it's politics for it. I want stronger leaders in local communities and people that lead their families well, lead their businesses well, and then, of course, in the political sphere, there's cities, towns, counties, states, and then, all that stuff happens in DC will end up being fine. But right now, I'm not really sure. It's pretty bad in Congress. Like, you talk to the senators, congressmen and women, and I mean the good ones, talking about economics, it's just pitiful. So I'm not like sitting around saying I gotta give my book to some senator in North Dakota and hopefully they kind of get educated on Freedom Hayek so they can vote better on the next bill. All that would be good in theory, but that's not the low-hanging fruit. Where we have a crisis of leadership in our country is in business. These business leaders are the weakest, softest, most unprincipled, embarrassing. I can go on. I'm going to just insult them. You have no idea the contempt that will for these business leaders that have made their fortune doing the right things, creating goods and services to meet the needs of humanity, doing it profitably, doing it efficiently, doing it competently. Good leaders of men and women in a boardroom and corporate organization to make good decisions. Now, yes, it is true of Wall Street, Fortune 500, Fortune 100, but you can fit really successful small businesses, family businesses in there as well. And then now, all of a sudden, in a raging culture war, they're afraid to defend free enterprise. They're afraid to defend capital markets. It is infuriating. So if I had to pick right now, and someone said, you're going to get some kind of leverage upside, and you can pick your weapon of either strong principal leadership in the business community or in Capitol Hill, I take the business community every day of the week and twice on Sunday. And so I am a perennially optimistic person. How could I not be? I do think it will happen. But and that has to be the vision of the people in this room. It has to be the vision of this great university. It has to be the vision of people who have been successful in their own businesses, that they will not deny the things that have enabled their success, and they will defend the system in which they live. And so that's the kind of principle of courageous leadership that I think is needed. What was the second part?
And how can we in this room go out into the world as we start our work?
And that's where, yeah.
Evangelize them.
Yeah. Father Sirico talks about this in his book, Defending the Free Market. If I were a college student today and I could come back, 28 years, I would be intrigued by a message of unfettered free markets and Ayn Rand and all these things, but I wouldn't be inspired. What I am selling is the most inspiring thing anybody could ever have to offer, which is the notion of truly helping cause of humanity for the right theological reasons in the right theological way. And that requires people to get a foundation of understanding these things. So that when there's a financial crisis and we go, look, you said markets were a great way to allocate resources, and now we have a financial bubble, or now we have a big surge of unemployment. That was the attack out of the Great Depression. Everyone said Calvin Coolidge failed, free markets failed, Roaring Twenties failed, classical liberalism failed. None of those things failed. And the heavy attack that's happening on those things right now, including from friends on the right, is wrong. Those things didn't fail. We lack the philosophical foundation. We lack the metaphysics to defend free markets the right way. And that's what I would say to you guys, is get intellectually prepared with the theoretical, because then the practical is going to come fine. And again, I'm not talking about my book here, but that's what the book is intended to do, is provide a kind of just a reset button around human flourishing, human action, the knowledge problem that Friedrich Hayek talks about, the kind of basic components of what a worldview of free economics looks like.
Thank you so much, sir. I appreciate it.
Thank you for your question.
Thank you so much for visiting today. My name is Jamie. I'm in the Master's of Science and Business program here at Busch School. So you spoke a little bit about free enterprise societies and the next generation of free enterprise. So just me being me, I'm kind of looking ahead and curious, what do you see as opportunities or limitations in fully decentralized networks like Web3? And follow-up question to that, do you think decentralized networks like public ledger would occur disingenuous non-virtuous?
No, I do not. And the reason is that I do not believe virtue comes from mechanics. I think that virtue anthropologically speaks to obedience or disobedience in our relationship with our Creator. So that fundamentally, moral formation comes from the most inconvenient of things, like actually being rude by our mom and dad, and being trained in our schools, having discipline, having accountability. It's a full character formation that is never computerizable or digitizable. And I always love the idea of shortcuts, and I love the idea of efficiencies. But if there's one thing I don't think can be made more efficient technologically, it's obedience, because the Bible teaches us that obedience flows out of the heart. And I don't think they can put our heart on the blockchain. Will you tell me something? Does my answer disappoint you? No. Okay. It's a good question.
My name is Joe Riley. I'm also in the Master of Science program here. I was wondering if there are any companies, Fortune 50 or even Fortune 500, that you could point to that might be enacting this vision.
Sure. The funny thing is, almost all of them are enacting the vision, like enacting, right? Living. They're all creating goods and services, employing people, giving them telos, giving them opportunity They all employ the concept in their own balance sheets that P minus C equals W. None of them go set out to destroy wealth. They all are accountable to shareholders. So there is an enacting, in a sense, where all of them are doing it because they're just very good operators and proprietors. They're efficient providers of goods and services to a marketplace. But enacting the vision holistically, meaning doing so with courage or with commitment to virtue. I believe that where you hear talk in Fortune 500, certainly Fortune 50, about virtue, it is entirely anti-virtue. It is pharisaical, it is virtue signaling, it is mostly rooted in some sort of rationalistic, naturalistic ideology that is antithetical to Christianity. I don't even know how many of them really believe it. There are plenty of new. This is something George Gilder and I have debated a few times because he's really optimistic that all of them are just full of it. And in optimistic meaning, he thinks that's a great thing. And I think he's mostly right. I think most of them don't believe the nonsense they say. But I am concerned that more and more do believe it. And part of it is most Fortune 50 CEOs are products of the Ivy League. And I think you come out of Ivy League, you're pretty well indoctrinated to a lot of this stuff, to be hostile to family, hostile to traditional values, and certainly hostile to marketplace. And so I wish I could just peer into the hearts and minds of Fortune 500 CEOs, or I wish I could get all of them to do what maybe 10 of them have done with guys like me and Tim, which is tell us what they really think offline. When you can get a little truth serum in them, it's usually a beverage, and they admit that they're fighting this thing too because they don't want to be called in front of the media or order this or that. It's a mess up in the culture. But I don't really care. I don't have a lot of sympathy for that because these guys are going to be fine. These guys and gals are going to be fine. But one of them is going to do it. One of them is going to stand up to the local law, and they're going to change the world. I don't know who it's going to be. Someone's going to have to do it. Maybe they will be. That's what maybe they have to do.
David, thank you again. It is our hope to. Wrapping up, David, a couple of them that have one-on-one questions, and I think great for minutes. So if anybody has questions, one-on-one, for that. The rest of you will see you next week. Thank you very much.